phrase price out of paradise time and time again, but what does it really look like and how can we solve this issue? To tackle this topic, we are joined today by Sterling Higa, the Executive Director of Housing Hawaii's Future. This organization is working to keep locals living in Hawaii, especially young professionals, young families, and the next generation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Sterling.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Yeah, so just want to get straight into it. From the name of your organization, it's pretty clear what you guys do, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what Housing Hawaii's Future does.
So at Housing Hawaii's Future, we know that the next generation is the key to solving all of the great issues that we face as a society. Young people have been at the forefront of the movement for social justice. They've been at the forefront of the environmental movement. And now it's their time to be in the lead of the movement for affordable housing and workforce housing. So the concept of Housing Hawaii's Future is if we can get the next generation educated and organized, they become the most powerful advocates for housing, especially because they end up being the group that is affected so much so that they're having to leave Hawaii at the moment.
Absolutely. And I was wondering why specifically your organization wants to focus on this younger generation.
Well, one is the founders of the organization are young people. So Zachary Amata and Evan Gates. Zach was a recent college graduate. Evan was a college student taking a gap year at the time that they came up with the idea for Housing Hawaii's Future. And they were afraid because they had seen their classmates already giving up hope. And, you know, it's one thing to be like 40 or 50 and to give up hope and become cynical and jaded. But these were teenagers, people in their early 20s who had already said, I give up. There's no way I can ever own a home in Hawaii. I'm leaving. And what Zach and Evan realized is if young people didn't start becoming part of the solution, they were just going to watch their friends leave year after year after year. Myself, I'm a little bit older, and every year since I graduated from high school, I've seen more and more of my friends leave to start their families and their careers elsewhere. And as I look at my own children, I hope that they don't have to make that choice to leave, that if they want to, they can afford to stay here.
Absolutely. And I feel like for me as well, this is a topic that's been on my mind. I was grateful enough to find a job back home in Hawaii, the place that I grew up, born and raised. And when I look at the housing market right now, thinking of my parents who were able to buy a house in their late 20s and the price was maybe $250,000 for a single family home. Right now, the median price is I think just a little below 1 million, but for 19 months before that or 20 months before that, it was a million and higher. And seeing those numbers can be very discouraging. But what hope does this organization bring to this?
Well, in the time that we've been active, we've seen a groundswell of support at the county and the state level from decision makers. It's not our doing that's driving this. Obviously, people in our community have realized that this is a crisis, and so young people getting involved is just the tipping point, right? There are tons of advocates who've been working on affordable housing and workforce housing for decades, and we just want to be able to push their efforts over the edge and create durable change. The most inspiring thing is to see young people take this into their own hands, because it's one thing to have older people, let's say, you know, the baby boomers, advocating and coming up with the housing policies for the next generation. And it's quite another thing for the next generation to be driving those ideas themselves. And if we're going to inherit these decisions and live in Hawaii for the next 50, 60 years, then we should be part of the decision-making process, right? It's decisions by us, not decisions for us. And that's why the next generation has to be involved, active, right? Whether it's at the neighborhood boards, at the county council, at the state legislature, or just in their own communities, advocating for their vision of what kind of housing, what kind of community we should have. So it's really a movement for increased civic engagement from young people. You know, housing is the huge part of it, but the broader question is, like, what kind of society do we want to live in? And
Right.
can we be involved in working together to form a shared vision of what that looks like?
Absolutely. And I feel like that's the one thing that we have a voice, and we just need to get the right people in office, people who kind of understand our needs, that are going through it as well, and trying to get that change through that way. And how exactly are you guys working to get these young people into these certain like neighborhood boards, all of these things? Really, the education part of it.
Yeah, for neighborhood boards, a lot of it is just raising awareness. Many people under the age of 40 aren't even aware that the neighborhood board system exists on Oahu. Uh, and these neighborhood boards, oftentimes, there are 2, 3, 4 vacancies on a neighborhood board where if anyone shows up to a meeting, they can just join the neighborhood board and get involved. And that gives them access to city and state officials. It lets them learn about the political process. It lets them figure out what issues are important in their community. And it's an important first step in the kind of ladder of civic engagement. It's encouraging because if we look at the county councils, if we look in the state legislature, both of the housing chairs in the state legislature, Representative Troy Hashimoto, Senator Stanley Chang, are millennials. So we're starting to have these, next generation leaders matriculate into these positions of authority over housing, whether at the county or the state level, and start to influence decision making. What hasn't happened yet is the groundswell of young people getting involved and advocating. And so you have a lot of decision makers who would like to create more radical change, but they can't do anything radical unless there's a public voice calling for it.
Absolutely. And I also know one of the big things about Housing Hawaii's future is pushing this stay movement. And there's a pledge for that people can sign up for. I was hoping you could explain what exactly it says in that pledge.
Sure. The stay movement is about people making a pledge to get educated, to get involved, and to get active. I think the number one driver for people at first is worrying about themselves, their children, their grandchildren. And the question is always, well, what is the next step? How can I get involved? And so the Stay Movement Pledge is a simple action that people can take. Right now, 1,500 people have signed on to this pledge, and it's a pledge to get educated and to get involved. And we then share information about more ways that people can get civically engaged with the issue, try to help them understand some of the more nuanced elements of it. I think people get intimidated when they hear AMI or inclusionary zoning or all of these different terms. And so at Housing Hawaii's Future, we really want to simplify this vocabulary so that people realize they are already capable of participating in this conversation. They don't need to feel intimidated. Just having the bare minimum understanding of the issue allows people to feel confident to advocate for what they believe in and what they want to see. And our goal with the Stay movement is to get people from the sidelines into the game, right? And the first step is understanding, well, how do I get involved?
Yes. And, want to talk about affordable housing. That vocabulary is always being thrown around. Affordable housing this, affordable housing that. But what exactly does affordable housing mean?
Yeah, and this is where I think housing advocates in the past, in my opinion, have made a mistake, which is many housing advocates will start to talk about 80% AMI or 140% AMI or $76,000 or $118,000. And the truth is, affordable housing looks like a family, at least the federal guidelines, spending less than 30% of their income. And people are listening to that and falling asleep. If you think about affordable housing, it means that someone who's on a very low income can afford their housing and also afford all of the other things they need, their food, medical expenses. It means that a family can afford their housing and also afford to educate their children, to make sure that they have all these other resources. And at the broadest level, what we have to do is bring down the cost of housing for everyone in our community. So that's the cost of housing for someone who's homeless and needs a very affordable place to live and may receive government assistance. That's for somebody who has a minimum wage job and might require some assistance. But it also means making housing affordable for a middle-class professional. So a lot of the people that are leaving, they're workers in the trades, they're nurses, they're civil servants, they're people who have what would otherwise be solid middle-class jobs. And what we have to make sure is at every income level, there's a abundant housing options. And it's not just about the affordability, it's also about the availability, right?
Right.
Where if I go on Craigslist today, yeah, there might be units I can afford, but I can't afford, if I'm a renter, to go to 10 different showings and apply for each one and then
Right.
get turned down for each one because they already filled the unit. Because if I am a working person with a family, that's just not okay. If we had abundant affordable housing where you needed a house, you could afford to pay, you looked, there was something, you got in, and that was great, that would make life so much easier. But we do have a real scarcity where there just isn't enough affordable rentals, there aren't enough affordable for purchase options. And one of the distinctions I think that gets missed is people will say, okay, if you're a middle class person, you don't need housing. There was a person at a county council meeting in Honolulu recently who literally said this. This person said, middle class people, they don't need housing, they want housing. And I thought to myself, this is just completely wrong, right? Like,
Right, yeah.
middle class people need housing too, and they should have housing options available. And so what we say at Housing Hawaii's Future is, yes, we need to build housing for the homeless. We need to ensure that they have a safe place, that they have dignity. We need to build housing for people on low incomes. We need to make sure that they have the assistance they need to have housing security. And then for those who are middle class, right, who have good paying jobs, we need to make sure that they have rental options, but also for sale options, that they can own a home. Because many of them, that's the moment they decide to leave, is they're at a point financially where they can afford to buy a home, and they look around and there are no homes available in their price range. And then they look at Nevada or Arizona or Washington, and they say, oh, I can go there and buy a home today.
Yeah.
And they go because they want to own a home. So home ownership opportunities, workforce rentals, affordable rentals, transitional housing, emergency housing for the homeless. You need to have abundant housing across the spectrum. In any other situation, right, if we said, food is a human right, we wouldn't say, hey, if you're middle class, you don't need food.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And yet sometimes with housing, we say exactly that. We say, okay, if you're really poor, yeah, you need housing. But if you're middle class, you don't need housing, right? Like, we should allow the dignity of housing for every member of our community. Like, housing should be considered a human right, and we should ensure that everyone has access to it. And that's what we stand for at Housing Hawaii's Future.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting point that person brought up in that town hall meeting, that the middle class don't need housing, but the middle class are who have children who are going to our public school systems and other schools in Hawaii, and their parents are the ones that are working for Hawaii. They are the people that, whether they be teachers, firefighters, policemen, essential services to our community, those are what those people are doing. And when we lose those middle class people who are not able to have that housing, it's like, who is left? And I think that's a big thing about that stay movement, and keeping the people who make Hawaii in Hawaii. And I know this is easier said than done, and this topic of being able to have this housing availability be here, how exactly do you make that a reality?
Yeah, $1 million question, right? We're going to solve this problem in the next 10 minutes. There are a variety of approaches. One of them is just the public sector taking a more active role in providing resources. So what do the county and state governments have? Well, they have land, for one. Oftentimes, say the Department of Education has an old school site that's underutilized that could be used for housing. The state recently turned an old detention center on Alder Street into housing, from an empty detention center into 200 affordable units. So land. The state can provide infrastructure, right? So if the state makes investments or the county makes investments in wastewater, in sewer, right, in water capacity, in roads, transportation, then it reduces the cost for the developers to build housing. And the state and the county can provide financing, right? They can provide low interest or no interest loans to allow projects to pencil out. Then there's a whole second category of ways that government can help, which is reducing the regulatory burden or the barrier to building. So because of zoning restrictions, a lot of times we're limited in the density that we can build, even in the urban core of, say, Honolulu, where some of the types of housing that you would see in cities that have solved their housing problems, like Vienna, are illegal to build in our city of Honolulu. And what we have to do is look to the rest of the world to figure out what are the kinds of housing that they're building to solve their housing problem, and how can we make sure that that's legal, and how can we make sure that that's easy to build with certainty. Because for a developer, if you have to go through a 2-year process and maybe you can build, you're going to go somewhere else, right? If you have certainty where you at least know, okay, if this is the kind of affordable housing project I'm going to build, then I will be able to build it, then they're more likely to build that affordable housing here. So reducing the regulatory burden and producing certainty, and shaping both public policies to drive toward the kind of housing that we want. So there is an attitude sometimes of not in my backyard or NIMBY, people who are saying we don't need housing. What we have to shift to instead is having a positive vision for what we want, right? We have to come together and say, in the ideal world, what kind of housing would we be building? What would make this a community that young people would want to live in, that could afford to stay in? And make sure that all of our public policy is shaped to produce that, right? So we're providing the land, the infrastructure, the financing, we've reduced the regulatory burden so that we can build the kind of housing that helps local families, right? Obviously, it would be a complete mistake to provide all of those things, land, infrastructure, financing, reduce all the regulatory burdens, and then we build like $10 million condos and penthouses, right? So shape the policy so that what comes out at the end is housing that supports the people of Hawaii. And that's, broadly speaking, what we want to drive toward with Housing Hawaii's future.
Yeah, and thinking about it too, I feel like when my parents were buying houses, there was a lot of like new communities being built up, and a lot of that were single family homes. Right now, the only new single development or single family home development that I know of is the one right by Waipio Costco. But a lot of the affordable housing that's being popped up are these huge buildings that are in downtown, Kaka'ako. There's even ones that they're trying to build closer to like the main schools, like high schools, like Iolani, Kaimuki High. And in your opinion, would you say that Hawaii's future in housing is kind of going to be more geared toward these more condo apartment style living, or more single family homes?
Well, there's been a real shift in our demographics. So, my grandparents had 5 children. And that was very normal back then in the 50s and 60s to have 5 or more children. So family sizes were a lot bigger then. But now you have a lot of aging people who are aging singly. You have younger people who aren't married or who are a couple but they don't have children. So the family sizes have shrunk steadily over time, which means that you need more housing units and you need different kind of housing units. You don't necessarily need a single family home. Now, for my family personally, my wife and I have a 4th child on the way, so we'll have a family of 6. A single family home is great for us, right? It meets our family's need. So what you have to think about is across the spectrum of housing needs, are all the housing needs being met? Maybe I'm a family with 4 children and I need a single family home. Is there a single family home for me? Maybe I'm young, single, just out of college. I need an inexpensive rental close to the city so I can get to work by walking and save some money for a down payment on a home. Maybe I'm a young couple and we've just had a baby and we want to move from a studio to a 1-bedroom, right? Or maybe we have a couple of kids and we want to move from a 1-bedroom to a 2-bedroom. A just society has abundant housing so that every stage in a person's life cycle, they have the correct housing type for them. The mistake I think people make is to think that housing is a static thing. You're going to buy one house and live in it forever. But the truth is, housing is a dynamic thing where, a few years ago, I lived with my mom, right? And then if I'm married, right, then I'm going to start a household of my own and I may need a new situation. One of the issues right now is there's a lot of what's called pent-up demand. So a lot of young people our age are living with their parents. They would prefer not to live with their parents, but they can't afford to leave. And them not being able to afford to leave means they don't become independent, right? They're not able to start a family of their own. They're not able to strike out. They may not be able to move closer to where their jobs are, which means they're stuck in commutes. And some of that pressure is what leads people to leave because they don't have the option to start their own independent life here. The other thing is, we think a lot about aging in place at Housing Hawaii's future, which is we have to have senior housing options. Because let's say you've lived in Waipahu your whole life. You should have the option to continue to live in Waipahu. Let's say you're getting older. You don't need a whole single family home, but you don't want to leave Waipahu. All the people you love are there, the places you know. Why not in every community have options that track along the life cycle? So someone can say, I want to stay in my community, but I want to age in place. Is there a senior facility available for me? And then if that senior is able to move from, say, their single family home into a senior housing unit, that frees up that home for a younger family to move into the community so we can repeat this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great way to explain it, this cycle. And I feel like for some people, it is that, like, they buy one house and they're in that house, their whole life. But in reality, like, if you're straight out of college right now, you can't just go and buy a single family home or even a condo or a townhouse. Like, you really have to work your way up to that. And I think one of the things that are really interesting about affordable housing is sometimes when you look at the prices, it isn't actually quote unquote affordable, and kind of a way to, like, what is a way to actually make it more affordable?
Yeah. At the state level, at the county level, if you're able to provide land infrastructure and financing for development, you can really bring down the cost for the buyer. If you're able to reduce the regulatory burden, you can reduce the costs even further. And then on the other end, we have to have better financial literacy education for our young people in Hawaii. I'm a public school graduate, and I did not receive very good financial literacy education in high school as well. And most of my classmates and people who graduated around the same time as me speak to the same experience. We're one of the states that does not have any financial literacy required for graduation. So you can study math, you can study English, social studies, but you are not required by the time you graduate with a public school diploma in our state to know anything about how to balance your budget. So one of the challenges, and I've talked to a lot of realtors, loan officers who deal with local families, is they have a good paying job. They should be able to afford a house, but they haven't been equipped with the budgeting skills or the financial know-how to be able to get into that house. So in addition to making sure we're lowering the cost of housing, we have to support efforts that are helping people to prepare for home ownership, like Hawaiian Community Assets, which does loan counseling and helping people with financial counseling. There are a variety of programs like the Hawaii Home Ownership Center that help prepare people for home ownership. And we need to expand these programs that exist, but also really look at our K through 12 DOE and say, how can we make sure that everyone who graduates from high school understands the basics of budgeting, they understand how debt works, right? They understand how credit cards work, so that if they're able to get a job, they're then able to start saving and preparing for home ownership. So if, again, with that life cycle, to get somebody ready for home ownership, it doesn't start, 2 years before they're ready to own a home. Ideally, it should start from the time they're in school, where they're learning about how to save and they're learning about how to eventually become a homeowner.
That is such an important point, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. And being financial literate is so important. And it goes more than this housing topic, right? Because in order to buy a house, you also need to be able to, pay off your mortgage, but also get food on the table, pay for gas if you're commuting, maybe even paying off your car if you bought one. And there's all these different topics and different things that you have to think about for expenses wise. And, if you just go back straight to, if you put it into the education system and being being able to have students to learn about how to go about this, because it is an essential skill in life. And it just goes to show that while housing is one thing, it does encompass all the things of having to, the costs of living in Hawaii and in order to stay and survive here. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about why is it so important to keep locals in Hawaii?
Well, there are all of these cliches, right? Like politicians will say the value of Hawaii is our people. There's a real truth to that, where Hawaii, because of its mix of Polynesian, European, and Asian cultures, has a very distinctive culture here, something that is truly special. We are this intersection between the East and the West and the Pacific, right? That there's no other place that has something like this. And the people that have had generational ties here, but especially the Native Hawaiians, deserve to have the opportunity to call Hawaii home in the future. And at this point, more than half of all Native Hawaiians live outside of the state, which is a real tragedy, right? Where we say that, the value of Hawaii is its people. And to an extent, that's true, because our number one export at this point is people, right? We just export people, right? And we export people who are brilliant, who have a lot of talent and skills and abilities and knowledge that they could contribute back into their community. And they're just not able to stay here because of the cost of housing. So it's not to say that everyone needs to stay here, What should be possible is that everyone has the option to stay here. And in talking to young people today, they don't feel like they have that option. And they should. Every member of our community should feel like this is the place I was born and I can have a future here. And when people shift into having that optimism, then we'll have a functional society.
Yes, and I just wanted to end with one of these posts that I saw that Hawaii's Housing Future had on their Instagram, and it really caught my attention, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. True sustainability means that our children and grandchildren can afford to stay here. Renewable energy, yes. Sustainable agriculture, yes. But if the only people around to enjoy that are Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Oprah, then we have failed. We have to ensure that while we make all of these adaptations for sustainability, we're not losing the people that make Hawaii, Hawaii. And I just wanted to end on that because it really resonated with me, because I also host the Repairing Earth podcast, which focuses on climate change and the people that are working to combat it in Hawaii. But you bring up such a great point of, if we want to do all these great things for our islands, we have to make sure we're able to keep the people who make Hawaii, Hawaii in Hawaii.
The sustainability of people.
Yes.
And this is where I think the movement for housing, abundant, affordable housing, and the movement for the environment have a lot in common and can work in close conjunction. Because when we talk about the kind of transit-oriented development that allows for density, that allows people to have comfortable lives, not have to spend all their money on owning an automobile, these are things that both housing advocates and environmental advocates can come together around, right? And we should be driving together to say, look, we can have environmentally sustainable communities, and they should be the kind of communities that local people can afford to live in. If we're putting up solar panels on $2 million homes, that's great.
Yeah.
But if we're also losing 10,000 people every year, that's not so great. So those two things need to be paired. And true sustainability, like you said, it means that our children and grandchildren, and, we could go on, and grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren, right, can afford to stay here. There should be a continuity across time that allows people to inherit, the greatness that comes from the past and be able to transmit that on into the future, ideally in perpetuity forever. And that's the goal, ultimately, is that true sustainability that balances our concern for the environment with our concern for each other and for the next generation.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sterling, for joining me today to talk about housing, the people who are affected, and kind of what we can do to start working to figure out this issue and make it a reality to keep locals keep living in Hawaii. And I really just appreciate you
Awesome.
coming in.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Yes, thank you so much. To learn more about Housing Hawaii's future or to join the Stay movement, head to hawaiinewsnow.com. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and mahalo for listening.